Every silence has a story. Sometimes it's not what the world says that matters, it's what the world chooses not to say. Tonight, we're going to explore a silence that has shaken headlines, raised questions, and revealed hidden truths. The quiet global reaction to the Kabul Blast. Why did world leaders stay silent? What message lies behind this calm? Stay with me till the end, because what you're about to hear isn't just about politics. It's about how silence in a world full of noise can sometimes speak the loudest. A powerful explosion shook the heart of Kabul, sending shockwave not only through Afghanistan but across the world. In the aftermath, the streets were filled with confusion, grief, and unanswered questions. For the Afghan people, it was another reminder of the fragile reality they live in, a place where peace still feels like a distant promise. But what made this tragedy even more striking was not the event itself, but the silence that followed it. Normally, when such incidents occur, global leaders, organizations, and news outlets react swiftly, condemning the violence and calling for stability. This time, the global stage remained unusually quiet. Statements were brief, diplomatic, and carefully worded. It was as if the world had collectively taken a step back, watching but not speaking too loudly. To understand this silence, one must first look at the current state of Afghanistan in the eyes of the international community. Since the change in political power, many countries have struggled to define their relationship with the Afghan authorities. Some recognize them in practice, but not in name. Others maintain a distance while keeping a cautious line of communication open. This has created a delicate balance, one where every word from a foreign leader can carry heavy political consequences. A statement too strong could be seen as interference, while too soft could be interpreted as indifference. Hence, silence becomes the safest choice. This also reflects a deeper global fatigue. The world has witnessed decades of conflict in Afghanistan, and many governments are now focused inward, dealing with economic instability, social unrest, and climate crises. For them, involvement in another nation's internal crisis feels like a door they are hesitant to reopen, yet behind this restraint lies the emotional truth, the realization that endless external involvement has not brought lasting peace. Many nations are now quietly rethinking how they engage with Afghanistan, preferring observation over reaction. The Kabul Blast, therefore, was not just a tragic event. It was a test of how the world chooses to respond to suffering in a new era of global politics. The muted reaction from leaders worldwide may seem cold, but it could also be a signal that the global community is moving into a phase of reflection rather than intervention, learning, perhaps slowly, that peace cannot be imposed, it must be nurtured from within. When the Kabul Blast occurred, what followed was not the usual wave of political statements, condemnations, and emergency meetings that often accompany such global tragedies. Instead, there was an almost coordinated quietness. This was not accidental. It was calculated. In a world of diplomacy, silence can often speak louder than words. The measured restraint shown by world leaders reveals a shift in how nations now approach crises in regions that are politically sensitive and deeply complex. Governments today operate under the constant weight of global scrutiny. Every word they release is dissected, interpreted, and sometimes weaponized. In the case of Afghanistan, this sensitivity has reached its peak. Since the withdrawal of international forces, no major country wants to appear as though it is trying to dictate or influence Afghan affairs. This diplomatic silence represents strategic calculation. For many countries, speaking too soon or too strongly risks upsetting fragile regional dynamics. Afghanistan's current leadership is not officially recognized by many nations, which creates a dilemma. How can one comment on a tragedy within a nation whose government one doesn't formally acknowledge? The result is a cautious distance, where empathy must be expressed without crossing political lines. Even multilateral institutions like the United Nations are careful, crafting their statements around humanitarian concern rather than political critique. Behind closed doors, however, discussions continue. Intelligence agencies monitor, diplomats exchange quiet messages, and policy advisors assess how every public reaction might affect regional relationships, especially with neighboring countries that have their own strategic interests in Afghanistan. In this sense, silence is not absence, it is strategy. It allows governments to observe, analyze, and decide when or if a public position is necessary. At the same time, this restraint also reflects the growing complexity of global politics. The international system today is not defined by clear alliances or simple narratives. Each nation must weigh how its words might influence trade, migration, or security partnerships. Afghanistan, once at the center of geopolitical competition, is now a symbol of cautious diplomacy, a reminder that even compassion must be expressed carefully. What appears as indifference is often a reflection of deep strategic caution, where silence becomes a form of communication, a way of acknowledging tragedy without igniting new political fires in an already volatile region. The quiet response from global leaders after the Kabul Blast cannot be understood without recognizing the shifting priorities that define today's world order. The global landscape in 2025 is dramatically different from what it was 2 decades ago. Economic uncertainty, inflation, energy security, and the rapid transformation of technology have become dominant political concerns. Major powers are now more focused on domestic resilience than on international intervention. Crises in Europe, conflicts in the Middle East, and economic slowdowns across Asia have forced leaders to look inward. In this climate of competing priorities, Afghanistan no longer commands the urgent global attention it once did. The tragedy in Kabul, while deeply human and painful, arrived at a time when the world's collective attention was already stretched thin. The shift is not purely emotional or political, it is strategic. Nations have realized that their ability to influence or stabilize distant conflicts is limited, especially when their own economies are under pressure. The age of large-scale foreign intervention has given way to cautious engagement, where countries prefer diplomatic observation and limited humanitarian involvement. In the past, Afghanistan symbolized global cooperation and, at times, competition. Today, it symbolizes the limits of external power. Governments have accepted that rebuilding or reforming another nation from the outside is a complex, often unsustainable mission. Meanwhile, the news cycle has become faster, more fragmented, and driven by new crises emerging every week. The attention of the public, and by extension their leaders, has become short-lived. Issues such as climate emergencies, artificial intelligence regulation, and economic transitions dominate discussions at global forums, leaving little space for deeper reflection on countries like Afghanistan. This is not due to apathy, but due to overload. The world is overwhelmed with challenges that feel immediate and interconnected. In this environment, Afghanistan's tragedies are viewed through a lens of cautious empathy rather than mobilized action. The blast in Kabul, though shocking, was absorbed quietly into a world already accustomed to instability. The global silence therefore reveals a hard truth about modern politics. that compassion is often constrained by capacity. The lack of strong international reaction does not mean the world has forgotten Afghanistan. It means the world is struggling to manage its own storms while watching from afar, hoping peace will eventually rise from within rather than being imposed from beyond. In the aftermath of the Kabul Blast, many nations found themselves in a delicate position. The question was not only how to respond, but whether to respond at all. Every statement in international politics carries weight. It sends signals, defines relationships, and can even reshape alliances. When it comes to Afghanistan, this sensitivity is magnified. The country's political structure remains complex and fluid, and many governments still wrestle with the challenge or recognize a single misplaced word could be interpreted as support for one side or condemnation of another. That is why silence for many world leaders became not an absence of empathy, but a form of strategic restraint, a way to acknowledge the tragedy without stepping into political quicksand. This caution is driven by a deep awareness of how fragile the diplomatic balance around Afghanistan has become. Since the withdrawal of foreign forces, no power wants to be seen as interfering or reviving old tensions. Yet, at the same time, no one wishes to appear indifferent to the suffering of civilians. It is a tightrope walk, one where every statement is measured, every tone analyzed, and every reaction compared. For leaders, a single public comment could affect relationships not just with Kabul, but also with neighboring countries who have their own complex interests tied to Afghanistan's stability. This fear of political missteps has led many to prefer silence over speech. Behind closed doors, discussions continue, but on the world stage, restraint dominates. It is an approach that prioritizes long-term diplomacy over short-term visibility. Governments today understand that speaking emotionally in moments of tragedy can lead to misunderstanding, escalation, or unwanted commitments. Instead, they choose a quieter path, allowing time, investigation, and diplomacy to guide their eventual words. Such silence, though often criticized, is also a reflection of maturity in global politics. The era of immediate reactions is slowly giving way to calculated patience. Nations are learning that not every tragedy demands instant commentary. Sometimes reflection speaks louder than rhetoric. The cautious silence after the Kabul blast is therefore not a sign of neglect, but of awareness, and understanding that in a world already charged with conflict, a few unguarded words can do more harm than good. Amid the global silence following the Kabul blast, one contrast stands out clearly. While political leaders chose restraint, humanitarian organizations quietly continued their work on the ground. This contrast reveals an important truth about the modern world. Compassion and politics often move at different speeds. Governments may hesitate to speak due to diplomatic consequences, but aid workers, doctors, and local volunteers act without waiting for permission. Their mission is not shaped by recognition or political boundaries. It is guided by the urgency of human need. In the quiet chaos that followed the explosion, these humanitarian actors became the voice of conscience, the reminder that beyond politics, lives are still at stake. The tension between political caution and humanitarian urgency is not new, but it has grown sharper in recent years. International aid agencies often operate in complex political environments where even their presence can be misinterpreted. Yet they persist, driven by a belief that neutrality is the strongest form of courage. While world leaders calculate words, humanitarian workers calculate survival. How many lives can be saved today? How many families can be supported tomorrow? This silent commitment stands in stark contrast to the carefully measured language of diplomacy. At the same time, this situation exposes the limits of global politics. When nations hesitate to act or speak, it is these humanitarian networks that keep hope alive. They are often underfunded, overstretched, and working in conditions that will make most governments withdraw entirely. Still, they continue to deliver aid, education, and medical support, proving that compassion can exist even when political will fades. Their efforts remind the world that silence at the top does not always mean inaction below. This balance between empathy and caution defines the world's current relationship with Afghanistan. It shows that the global community, while politically cautious, still possesses moral awareness. Humanity finds its way through the cracks of diplomacy. The ongoing humanitarian work in Kabul is not just a response to tragedy, but a quiet declaration that people matter more than politics. It reflects a world that, even in silence, still listens. A world learning that true peace begins not in the halls of power, but in the hands that reach out to help when no one else dares to speak. When the world remains silent after a tragedy, it is easy to assume that silence means indifference. But sometimes silence carries meaning deeper than words. The quiet response to the Kabul Blast may not reflect a lack of care, but rather a deliberate choice, a form of restraint that recognizes the weight of history. After decades of intervention, war, and political promises, the international community has learned that speaking loudly does not always lead to peace. Sometimes words can inflame wounds that are still healing. By remaining cautious, world leaders might be acknowledging that Afghanistan's story now belongs first and foremost to its own people. This silence can also be seen as a moment of collective reflection. Nations have realized that rushing to react, to assign blame or express outrage can unintentionally deepen divisions. The global community is still learning how to respond to crises in ways that respect sovereignty while upholding human rights. The Kabul Blast, tragic as it was, became a mirror reflecting that struggle, how to show empathy without control, how to care without interference. Silence, in this sense, becomes a language of observation and respect, even if it feels uncomfortable to those seeking immediate answers. It also signals a shift in moral understanding. The world is learning that not every situation demands a public declaration. Sometimes quiet attention and measured action are more meaningful than dramatic speeches. Behind the scenes, humanitarian assistance continues, diplomatic contacts remain active, and policy discussions evolve. The absence of noise does not mean the absence of awareness. Rather, it reflects a world that has grown weary of performative politics and seeks a more authentic, sustainable way to engage. In a broader sense, this silence may symbolize maturity, a collective realization that peace cannot be shouted into existence. It requires space, patience, and listening. Afghanistan's journey is being watched, not forgotten. The global silence surrounding the Kabul Blast could therefore represent a form of respect, a recognition that this moment belongs to reflection rather than reaction. Sometimes, when the world grows quiet, it is not because it has turned away, but because it has finally understood that true healing begins when the noise ends and the lessons begin to unfold. In the end, the silence surrounding the Kabul Blast tells us something profound about the world we live in today. It reminds us that humanity is evolving, learning to observe before reacting, to think before speaking, and to respect before judging. The absence of loud political voices does not always mean a lack of concern. Sometimes it represents maturity, awareness, and an understanding that peace is not built through words alone, but through patience, compassion, and quiet persistence. The true story behind this silence is not about neglect, but about restraint, a global realization that nations must allow each other the space to heal, to rebuild, and to rediscover their own strengths. Afghanistan's pain is not forgotten. It continues to echo in the conscience of those who believe in unity over division and peace over politics. The world may be silent, but its eyes and hearts are still open. And perhaps in this stillness, a new kind of dialogue is beginning, one rooted not in power or policy, but in understanding. The challenge now is for all of us as individuals and nations to ensure that our silence is not empty but purposeful, that it leads to reflection, empathy, and action built on wisdom rather than reaction. To everyone listening, may you carry forward this message with hope. Let this moment remind us that the quietest gestures often hold the greatest meaning. Whether in politics, business, or personal life, learn the strength of calmness and the power of reflection. The world changes not only through speeches or declarations, but through hearts that understand before they act. Thank you for your time, your attention, and your spirit of awareness. May peace find its way not only into nations, but into the hearts of people everywhere. Wishing you all wisdom, courage, and good fortune in the journey ahead. And may every silence you encounter remind you to listen a little deeper and to lead with a little more humanity